Are you interested in the urban energy matrix? What do you think how our cities can change with abundant energy? How can we create the right energy from the right sources for our urban communities? Stay tuned for answers from Pears, Dorr, Ramez, Naam, and Mark Nelson.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. This episode is a panel discussion where the panelists discuss the different aspects of the urban energy matrix. Pears, Dorr, Ramez, Naam, and Mark Nelson talk about their vision for the future of cities, different energy services and sources, learning from the past, unprecedented future prospects, energy democracy, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Pears is one of Australia's leading energy efficiency experts. He has worked in the sustainable energy and environment fields since the late 1970s and been an expert advisor to federal, state, and local governments across Australia, as well as business organizations, community groups, and the private sector. His work spans all sectors of the economy, education, and community action. He has been involved in low-carbon urban design and green building projects, program and policy development, including building energy regulation, energy and climate rating of buildings, design of appliances and equipment. He is a senior industry fellow at RMIT University and a fellow at the University of Melbourne. Alan has received many awards, including being made a member of the Order of Australia in 2009. Dorr is the Director of Research at the independent think tank Rethink X. He is an environmental social scientist and technology theorist whose recent Rethink X publications have focused on the disruption of the global energy sector by new energy generation and storage technologies, as well as the implications of the energy, transportation, and food disruption for climate change. Adam regularly presents on stage, radio, podcasts, and television. He completed his master's at the University of Michigan's School for the Environment and Sustainability and his PhD at the UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs. Ramez Naam, a computer scientist and co-chair for energy and environment at Singularity University, is a leading voice in clean energy and innovation. Born in Cairo, Egypt, and raised in the US, he worked at Microsoft on early versions of Outlook, Internet Explorer, and Bing, and founded Apex Nanotechnologies, a pioneer in molecular design software. An award-winning author of 5 books, including The Infinite Resource and the Nexus Trilogy, Ramez is a frequent speaker on clean energy's price advantages and an angel investor in climate and mobility startups. He's launching a climate-focused venture capital firm. Based in Seattle, he is an adventurer who's climbed mountains, dived with sharks, and cycled Vietnam's coast. Mark Nelson, founder and managing director of Radiant Energy Group, is a clean energy consultant and holds a Master of Philosophy in Nuclear Engineering from Cambridge University and degrees in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. Mark's diverse background includes living in St. Petersburg, Russia, researching at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and working in Tajikistan Pants Factory. His research tracks electricity systems emissions, focusing on France and Germany, and explores energy returns' societal impacts. Featured in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, Mark, based in Chicago, is a middle-distance runner, avid photographer, and relentless analyst of electricity data. And with that, Ellen, Adam, Ramez, and Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm so excited about this conversation. And let's jump right in. What does the future of cities mean to you? Ellen, may I ask you to start?
Thank you. The future of cities, I think, is very challenging. We are dealing with the consequences of the early stages of climate change, and cities have enormous amounts of infrastructure that's not designed for the future climate. At the same time, we have amazing levels of innovation, such as virtual systems that mean physical travel might be changed into virtual solutions and things like that. We've got a really big issue that we have a lot of infrastructure and a lot of lifestyles that are really going to have to change a lot. We're going to have to work out ways of adapting all of this infrastructure and coping with the fact that a lot of cities are exposed to increasing floods, fires, storms. And so a lot of our infrastructure is actually fairly easily damaged. So I see those things as big, including things like forced migration, which will all make things pretty hard for a lot of cities.
Adam?
It probably won't surprise you to learn that I'm very optimistic, and that's on brand for both me personally and also for Rethink X as an organization. The main reason why is because the transformations that we see coming, driven by a convergence of key disruptive technologies, really do open the door to a fundamental phase change for civilization. And that, of course, means a major transformation for cities, for the built environment, for how we live and where we work and do other activities. So just very quickly, the basis of that is we're on the cusp of major transformations across multiple foundational sectors of the global economy at the same time. We're standing on the precipice of transformative technological change in energy, in transportation, in food production, and in labor simultaneously. This is, to my knowledge and to my team's knowledge, an unprecedented moment in human history. I'll probably dwell on two of those rather than talking about the whole picture, but in the very simplest terms, and again, why am I optimistic? It's because energy and labor are upstream of everything else. So everything else that we do, everything else that we produce, when you dig down through the dirt of every supply chain and every value chain, you hit bedrock ultimately at energy and labor. They are the primary factors of production that everything else reduces to, in effect. And they're, of course, interconnected and related, as all factors of production are. But if energy and if labor become cleaner, and if they become cheaper, so does absolutely everything else downstream of those things. We're on a trajectory really quite clearly now at this point, thanks to, again, convergence of key technologies. We're headed towards clean and superabundant electricity at near zero marginal cost, enormous supply at near zero marginal cost for the overwhelming majority of the populated regions of the world. And that, by definition, includes virtually all cities. And we're headed for the same, so superabundant supply, near zero marginal cost in labor. That labor is not going to come from human beings. It's going to come from machines. It's going to come from robots of various kinds. Robots on wheels in the forms of autonomous vehicles and equipment, and robots on legs in the form of humanoid robots and much else besides. And when you have energy and when you have labor, both approaching near zero marginal cost with an enormous supply, this is the ultimate unlock for civilization. Every other problem becomes tractable when you have an open-ended, huge supply of those two things, and they're clean. You can get your arms around almost any problem if you have enough energy and it's not damaging, and if you have enough labor. And we're going to have levels of energy and labor that previous generations were just unimaginable. That is fundamentally the reason why I'm optimistic. All the rest of the optimism and the details follows on from that foundation.
Ramez?
First, wonderful to be here. And this is a huge topic. Cities are, if we have a global brain today, cities are the neural superclusters of that brain. They are where the innovation happens. We know that innovation happens faster in cities. Even in this age of Zoom and virtual ways to connect and so on, we see that GDP per capita is just higher. When you get people in higher density, you have more idea sex, as Matt Ridley would say. Ideas bump into each other and spawn off new startups, new institutes, new artistic innovations, and so on. I'm a city boy myself, so I grew up in the country. Jeffrey West at the Santa Fe Institute has a quote that I love. He says that if aliens came down to Earth, they might come to believe that cities are actually the dominant organisms on Earth and humans are just cells or nodes in that superorganism. And said, I'm a science fiction writer myself, as you can see. All of that having been said, we have a huge opportunity and huge challenges. About half of the world's population is urban. That's a very loose definition of urban. I would actually think that's an overly broad classification, but that number is going up over time. And as been mentioned previously, as we industrialize agriculture across the planet, more and more people will move to urban areas. Migration moves people to urban areas. The opportunities are in urban areas. The areas have a lot of, just by dint of the fact that they're agglomerations of humans, agglomerations of our intellectual capital and so on, they will keep growing and they will keep being dynamic, but there are a number of challenges. Some of them relate to energy, but some of them relate to other things. In the US, certainly, and in the UK and many other parts of the world, Australia being one of them, we see that cities are not building housing fast enough. Even in the red states in the US, that's the case. Because on the same land, if you want to build, you have to go up. And so we live in societies that have created various rules to protect us and keep us safe and protect the environment, protect historic buildings. And all of those are becoming challenges to actually do the amount of sort of vertical expansion and creation of new infrastructure that cities need. Then we get into two other challenges and opportunities that I see. I think transport in cities is set to be transformed by things like autonomous vehicles, which will be almost entirely electric, since we know that electric vehicles on a per kilometer, per mile basis are already cheaper, and they're still plunging in cost. We've got the BYD Seagull at $10,000 in China. It'll come to the rest of the world eventually. So autonomous electric vehicles are amazing, but we already see today that Uber and Lyft on streets increase congestion for cities. So congestion itself becomes the limiting factor. And if you have these electric vehicles that need power and we electrify heating, which we must for climate reasons, we must switch from methane as the heating source to heat pumps across most of the planet, you could potentially double electricity draw in a city. I agree with what Adam was just saying, that the marginal cost of electricity is dropping to close to zero for at least for the best hours in the year, the sunny hours. But the price that we actually pay at consumption is not the wholesale price of generation. That price is dominated by a couple of other factors. On a temporal basis, the price is going to be dictated by the most expensive hours out of the year. The hours, usually in winter, when you have long cloudy periods, you can have a 10-day cloudy spell. You have low insolation for months at a time. In London, you get 1/7 as much sunlight in January as you do in June or July. And we don't have storage technologies yet to handle that. Integrating wind, of course, can help, nuclear, other clean, firm sources, but that's still like a serious challenge. I think we can go a long way on solar. I'm one of the original huge solar optimists, along with Rethink, but we will run into some challenges. But the even bigger problem is delivering electrons. In the US, the cost of generation per kilowatt hour has been dropping over the last 20 years due to natural gas and renewables. Awesome. CapEx annually in the US for generation is basically flat. CapEx for distribution, the last few miles, not the big transmission grid, but just the last few miles, has nearly tripled in the last 20 years. So if you ask me related to energy, what do I most worry about in cities? It's the poles and wires. It's the least sexy part of the energy system, is the part that is the bottleneck on everything. Don't get me started on transmission. That's also a problem. Like the long distance transmission is also a problem, but we haven't hit that yet. Distribution is the problem. Poles and wires, the transformers. And so that's one of the things we've got to figure out. How do we find a way to upgrade that infrastructure at low cost? Storage maybe is part of the story. Reconductoring maybe is part of the story. But so a lot of times you just have like very manual processes putting up new lines in various places. And finally, I'd say I'm a big fan of distributed energy, but we've got to be real that we have a serious cost problem with distributed energy. In the US, if you want to put up rooftop solar, it can only handle a relatively small chunk of urban energy. But the cost in the US of rooftop solar is 4 to 5 times what the cost of utility scale solar is. You do things at small scale, you just have problems. The electrician fees and just plugging into the building's electricity is a huge fraction of that. And labor is just less efficient. Similarly, batteries. Energy storage is actually one of the best solutions to the problems of the distribution grid. And it's amazingly cheap at large scale. We just have a new deal just announced in the Middle East, a new solar plus battery project where the cost per kilowatt hour of the batteries being deployed is about $50 per kilowatt hour. I think only 2 people on Earth predicted costs that low, and that was Tony Siva, Adam's boss, and myself. As far as I know, we're the only 2, and they're still dropping. Awesome. What's the cost of a Tesla Powerwall? 20 times that, $1,000 a kilowatt hour. And storage is actually more useful at grid edge than it is in big centralized deployments because it can make up for those distribution lines. But we've got like serious issues. We have not figured out how to do distributed energy nearly as cheaply as we should. So I'll pause there. Great to be here with you all.
And last but not least, Mark.
I have the advantage and disadvantage of going last. I think first I'm going to side with, shall we say, the optimists. I think that solutions today exist that there's an enormous amount of room to implement in cities. I'm also going to say that if we're pessimistic cities, We've got to be absolutely ridiculously pessimistic everything else, because the cities are the concentration of people, wealth, voters in the countries where that matter, angry crowds in the countries where that's the main way things get done, that will make the changes and defend access to resources and energy among those. This is what we're going to concentrate on this conversation. So my optimism for cities, again, comes from the fact that it was cities where we got the collective action to get fresh water first and sanitation first and power first. And a lot of really important steps forward, such as electricity itself, came because we had enough people in one place to afford to experiment and scale up. It sometimes took really strong government action against the market, shall we say, to force the energy advantages that cities had, like electricity, out to the farmlands, out to the smaller communities where it could do very well. It ended up being an exceptional thing to electrify all farms. It changed the way of life. It changed the nature of the industrial system to get electricity everywhere. But it came in cities first, and most obviously was in cities, and only then trickled outwards. I think that's what we're going to continue to see. The cities that beat the odds and make the most pessimistic observations come true, people will leave those cities and go to the cities that pull it off successfully. So even where some cities might either not have the governance or the cosmic luck to make the transformation work or to respond to either demographics or climate challenges, people will have to leave those cities, and they will end up in cities that, for better or worse, will gain in population. And hopefully that's where they will also solve problems that meet the needs of population. So I'm definitely optimistic with a little bit of pessimistic warnings in there. In terms of energy and what I think of the future of cities, I guess I am always advising people that much less is changing and much slower than a lot of people think from the point of today. It's shocking to read what people wrote about their lives changing in the 1890s or the 1910s or the 1930s. Hey, it makes the rate of change now seem incredibly slow compared to those few decades where we added power, heat, light, water to cities. I don't know what we can do to cities to make a change that big. Maybe only the furthest transformation with AI could do something like that. In a way, a lot of what AI might do is remove certain aspects of the human service economy. So when I visited India once, the family I stayed with had cooks and drivers, and it was almost like what it would be for me in America if we just get the robots to do the same thing. I don't mean to make a comparison socially, just the lived experience of being in a city where this service comes in that can drive you around. I mean, that's not nearly as big a transformation in my mind as the second industrial revolution, the 1870s through 1910s, where you added the water, heat, power, and then it went from the rich people areas and the office buildings to everybody else over the following decades, all the way up till after World War II. So I think cities have a great future. I think cities were the way future came about in the first place, and that the future will keep coming about because of what cities do in putting a lot of people and their demands and their votes in one spot. And I think that in terms of energy, people are rediscovering electricity the way I learned it, I suppose, as an engineer. They're rediscovering that there's such a thing as a transmission system. They're suddenly discovering, as Ramez said, the distribution system, and that those aren't the same things. They're suddenly discovering why we made the grid in the first place. I spent a lot of my early years in clean energy in 2015 through, say, 2023. I'd say 2015 through the launch of ChatGPT, when people suddenly and shockingly started learning about electricity really quickly. I was trying to explain to people we've always had grid storage. We built grid storage from the beginning. The grid is so we put a lot of demand together and aggregated it so we could build highly efficient power and then carefully share it. Just things like that. It felt like people heard of their favorite technology and went only backwards, learning about the grid, only one tiny byte at a time, in order to show why they didn't need to learn anything more and they already knew the answer. And I'm just delighted that we've arrived at a time where people are learning about the electricity system as a whole. Suddenly, since, again, 2023, since we have extreme demand from leading technological cases like AI that are pushing forward energy education for everybody, and especially for cities, where some of the worst collective decisions were made from, say, 2010 to 2023. I watched entire cities destroy their own power supplies because they're like, that's old energy. We want new energy. Wait, new energy? We have to have transmission? What's transmission? And you just watched some of the richest cities on earth destroy their own power supplies because they were completely confused about where power came from. And they thought that the future was about this or that technology and not the grid as a whole. So energy matrix to me is a mixture of technologies. And we're finally in a glorious future where from the top of cities to the bottom of the department, everybody is being forced to learn about those technologies. And the successful cities will be the ones that figure out how to improve this energy matrix. The unsuccessful cities will donate their populations and discontent to the successful cities.
This issue of abundant energy, I think, is a really important one to explore, because abundant energy is often, in Australia certainly, focused on lots of cheap renewable energy. And then, we've got to have batteries and transmission and networks. The issue to me, I've always started from the point that no one actually wants energy for its own sake or technology for its own sake, right? So when the smartphone appeared, people shifted from other things, right? Likewise, when we look at the evolution of things like, say, the smartphone or the electric vehicle or the e-bike, what we're seeing is that the amount of energy people are needing to deliver the services they value, and they're actually reframing what services they value as there's a whole interactive thing going on. So in that sense, I'm very optimistic about the energy future in Australia. We've got 40% of homes have got rooftop solar, and the government's just rolling out this massive battery program. We're moving fast. But, for example, a third of Australian households are renters, and they can't put in a battery or upgrade the building or do a whole bunch of things. And that's where I think that behind the PowerPoint technologies are going to be very important, because with the swappable battery and plug-in smarts, such as the balcony solar solutions in Germany, people starting to sell induction cookers with integrated batteries to avoid the need for an electrician to upgrade your wiring. At the same time, when you're looking at transmission stuff, Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories have done some very interesting analysis of what you can do if you put a whole lot of batteries on the back of a train and bypass power lines. If you actually look at this, if you can drop those batteries behind the meter, you can get retail prices, not wholesale prices, from feeding into the grids. Also, we looked at Hydro Tasmania, which is an island off Australia, and looked at how what they're starting to do is buy lots of the excess solar from the mainland through a cable. And people are saying, Tasmania exporting in summer the way they used to. And that's right, because they are sucking up all our negatively priced solar to store water for the winter when they produce electricity and sell it back to us on the mainland at a much higher price. So there's all sorts of games going on here. But I'm interested in things like, there's a story about one of the Asian countries about tuk-tuks, little three-wheel electric vehicles, electric ones being sold without a battery, so they're cheaper to buy than an internal combustion one. And then you have swappable batteries, so you don't have recharging issues and all that sort of stuff. But what it also means then is that the ongoing cost of paying for the swappable batteries is much lower than the fuel cost. So what you've got here is you've solved the upfront problem and the operating cost problem with a whole transformation. So I'm always looking at system solutions, and that's why, as I say, when I look at renters, and we have a lot of people in centrally controlled buildings, where efficient technologies with swappable batteries and smarts that you plug in, or you just build them into the appliances and things like that, I think are a really important way of solving the problem creatively that, as Ramez has said, we've got real problems with transmission and distribution systems, and Australia is right at the forefront of all these challenges. And we are just starting to focus on the fact that in the middle of winter, where I live, we have a quarter as much solar at a time when the demand for electricity, the demand for heat is really big. So we have to deal with all these things, but we can. And I think that's the sort of level of innovation that talked about is real and is exciting and is totally disruptive, but it shouldn't be all focused on supply side. And this is Australia's problem. We have got a massively supply side dominated culture, not just in energy, but in almost everything we do. We consume land, we consume all sorts of resources. So we have to reframe that much more from an integrated system approach, and to really ask the fundamental questions: what are the core services people really want and need? And then you open up all the possibilities of how differently we can do all those things. And that fits in with what Adam's been talking about with ThinkX.
I wanted to touch on It's a really provocative question, I think, that Mark asked, which was like, what could be as profound a transformation in cities as what we saw at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century? Is there anything that could compare to that? And maybe there isn't, but I would put two factors into play here to maybe spice up the discussion a little bit, because these are operative on the 10, 15, 20-year time horizon. The first is that autonomous electric vehicles, so the disruption of transportation, is going to make it much more feasible to enter and leave cities from a longer distance. So commuting. Right now, commuting is miserable because you have to drive the car, and because the cars are pretty unsafe and they are not designed for being ultra comfortable and safe for passengers. What I mean by that is that there are very few vehicles that have a bed inside them or a very comfortable lounge chair that you could sleep in or a workable office space. There are a handful of large RVs, we call them road vehicles, that could manage that. But for the most part, you can't get into a smaller vehicle and have an experience like that. You're stuck sitting in a seat that's very much like economy class in an airplane, which is not much fun. Either that or you're driving. When that changes, we could see people becoming much more comfortable living much further out and making their way in. And that will change habitation patterns in potentially a very large way. So that's the first wrench I would throw into the works here. And the second is that major reason why we congregate in cities, although not the only one, but a major reason, is for employment. It's where work and opportunities are. And work and employment are going to be gone 20 years from now. 20 years from now, there will be nothing a human being can do that artificial intelligence embodied in robots or artificial intelligence on its own can't do as well for a tiny fraction of the cost. So human beings, and my team has just put out work about this, but we're very firmly planted in the camp on the position that jobs are going away and society is going to totally reorganize around a new, fundamentally new paradigm. And we're going to have to figure out what to do. All the goods and services will still get produced. It's going to become a major distributional challenge. But in cities, the logic and structure and architecture and patterns that we've seen emerge in cities for millennia have, at the very least, been to a large extent, not exclusively, but to a large extent, set up that way because of employment, because human beings were providing the labor input to productive apparatus, productive enterprise and productive government functions and so on. That is going to change. And cities will become places where we don't work, we don't toil, we don't labor. Cities will become places where we play and we live and we seek out experiences. And it could be that changes their character in some extraordinary ways. It could also be that we might be surprised how little they change because of that. It could be that cities remain a lot the same, even if people aren't working. After all, there are plenty of fortunate people who don't punch a clock in the morning and still spend all of their time in cities. So I would just put those two things on the table for some interesting discussion, because I thought Mark's question was so profound, really. What could change cities as much as what we saw 125 years ago? And the answer is, you really have to reach out into Ramez's territory of science fiction to discover anything that could rock the boat in such large ways as that. It's a fun framing.
This is where COVID in Australia has started accelerating a lot of those things that you're talking about, because lots of people moved away from the city, working from home, commuting to the city a couple of days a week instead of 5. There's a whole lot happened, and it's been accelerated by COVID. And I think that's opening up the sorts of possibilities that you're talking about.
Adam's certainly being provocative here, and I love it. It'll make it spicy. As a sci-fi author, I am skeptical about mass replacement of humans in the wars. Not that one of it will happen. Like, certainly there's going to be some job shift and so on. The main reason I was skeptical is it's been predicted so many times in the past. Like going back to the 1810s, the 1820s, happening, I think John Maynard Keynes predicted we'd all have 7-hour work weeks by now, and I don't have a 7-hour work week. I don't know about you all. Who knows? This is a time of great change, and I think AI, LLMs caught a lot of us by surprise, caught nearly everyone by surprise, including people who work on them. And so we are in a period of uncertainty, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that we'll stop working. New ecological niches tend to open up. Nevertheless, I think it's interesting. I'm not sure how much it changes things either way, but to Mark's point, I think the biggest thing that is as big a change as what happened at the dawn of the 20th century is that there are still billions of people on Earth that don't live fully in the 20th century or live in the very early 20th century. And so if you think about what's going to happen most in cities, I think it's in the global South. I think it's people increasingly where agriculture and the country's lifestyle is still a large part of the population. I think it's going to be the formation of and mass migration to cities. And those cities often still don't have the sort of infrastructure those of us in the Western highly developed nations have. So I think that's quite interesting. Now, a couple of fortunate factors for those cities is they have a chance to do some things right that older cities can't do. It's much easier to build new infrastructure the way you want than it is to rip up old and replace. And two, just by chance, the greatest number of people who live in poverty on Earth today live in some of the sunniest places on Earth. So I think that is a benefit.
I just wanted to say that I think there's as much chance of AI, robotics, autonomous vehicles bringing what us city dwellers like about city to the suburbs and countrysides, as much as it is changing life and the pace of life in the city itself. I see that there in the countryside and small towns, there's a loss of population. There's a lack of people, a lack of helping hands, a lack of cheap labor, a lack of cheap thinking labor. All of these things in some ways promise a sort of revolution of the way you can live far from other humans more than I see them necessarily changing a lot in the city, though my confidence level is a little low. And Adam, I guess we have a lot that we're going to see in the future. As you were pointing out that our vehicles are not designed to spend a lot of time in, they're designed for us to be actively driving. Well, I also see a dark future where the pods from pod hotels are driving people around for cheaper than it is to get your own city apartment. So you're just having a population living in per night rentals and very cheap imported electric vehicles, going out to the edge of the city and then back in for the morning shift because it's cheaper to do that than it is to rent a place. So there's definitely going to be room for the dystopians to imagine a bunch of bad things. But in the end, it's still a radically safer and healthier environment than people on the margins of society would have been living in cities up until the 1960s in the first world and up until present day in the rough neighborhoods of the developing.
One thing I'm waiting for, haven't seen it yet, little discussion about it, is fully electric RVs, effectively a small apartment on wheels. If an RV were fully electric, if it had even better solar panels on the roof, so you could get a bit of a trickle charge, there's not enough surface area up there to charge you rapidly because there's not enough energy, not enough insulation from the sun falls on that footprint. But you could get a few miles a day, and certainly after with a couple of days, you could charge your batteries back up. If you could get the cost of moving an RV around low enough and it drove itself, that's very much like having an apartment that's mobile, that's not anchored to one location. And that can be quite a game changer for human habitation in general, if the cost of those approach the cost of renting an apartment. If you have to have a driver and you have to have, and they're very low fuel efficiency vehicles right now, the combustion engine RVs, they're getting 5-6 miles to the gallon. It's expensive to own and operate them. But one could imagine that changing, in which case, if you had an apartment that was very nice, that moved around, that could be a pretty attractive option. And that would change the dynamic of cities as well. So I don't know if that's quite at the same level of the other. It's certainly not at the level of adding sanitation or fresh water supply or electricity to a city. But if your housing can pick up stakes from the ground and start moving around, that's a pretty big change.
In Australia, we've got an enormous caravan culture. And in fact, when I was talking about that idea of behind the PowerPoint appliance technologies, the caravan sector in Australia is pioneering a lot of those things. A lot of the caravanning people, they open up their flexible PV system when they stop somewhere. They are fully self-contained and they are driving a combination of flexible but efficient behind-the-meter technologies because they haven't got enormous amounts of energy on the caravan. But if they do it right, they can have a really comfortable, enjoyable time. And a lot of people are retiring and driving around Australia in these vehicles. They've got all sorts of 2 to 3 kilowatt hour battery units that they can charge up. They can take it somewhere and charge it, and then they bring it back home. And there's a whole lot of flexibility. So I think the caravan culture, in Australia at least, is a bit of a leader into the sort of vision that you've been talking about, Adam.
What Tony Seba likes to say is that disruptors come from the edge, and that might be a good example. Sometimes the successful models of the future emerge from places you might not expect.
In some ways, I think the bold future may look like parts of the past that people have forgotten about. A lot of what we think of as the modern electricity utility came out of the city I'm in, Chicago. Some of the boldest and most aggressive innovators working for Edison and the original electricity system companies he set up came to Chicago, and they built a new world out of Chicago for many decades after the start of citywide electricity grids. the largest power plants in the world were built for the local utility here in Chicago. They kept setting records for how much electricity you made in one spot and they distributed over wires. It's fascinating to look at advertisements from the 1960s that if people didn't know that we were already doing this, they would put it in conferences called Bold Visions of the Future. So for example, John Hancock Building, very recognizable building in Chicago, a tall obelisk-shaped black glass and steel SOM, Skidmore, Owens and Merrill building. They advertise that proudly as all electric, everything electric. The modern convenience is everything electric. And how was the utility powering that? By building the greatest local fleet of nuclear reactors in the world. I've even seen an ad, I think it was for, of all things, from Union Carbide, questionable, but they had some role in the uranium business and they ran an advertisement in Chicago showing a little lump of uranium and said, this little lump of uranium powering your whole city. And so if we're looking at all electric and a vision of total electricity, clean electricity in terms of carbon, at least, I think that's pretty much not controversial to say anymore. We had the future in the past in Chicago. It wasn't for climate change, but it looks almost exactly like the solution people say they need now in terms of its characteristics. Other things that I think are interesting. So we built all these nuclear plants around Chicago. I wouldn't call them inflexible so much as ones where you don't save any money turning down the power at night. So what happened? A lot of the big skyscrapers, electric powered skyscrapers in the Loop in Chicago, in the downtown business district, got together and they made collective heating and cooling systems. For example, one of the greatest electricity demands in Chicago is going to come during summer air conditioning in office buildings. There's a giant ice system where at night, nuclear electricity comes into town, makes an enormous amount of ice, which basically has about the efficiency of doing heat pumps. So refrigeration cycles, making ice, and then the ice is melted slowly in these big chiller units during the day. And this ice water is pumped around to the buildings, air blown across it, water evaporated on it or condensed on it, drawing heat out of buildings. That's an example of something that you would think of almost the future, but in the past made possible by giant shared infrastructure running cheaply 24 hours a day, 365. So I think that the dawn of cheap batteries, there are some nuclear bros that are like, oh no, batteries are bad. I have to just laugh at them because if there's any technology that can make nuclear really competitive in a world of inexpensive solar, especially inexpensive and politically popular solar, what could possibly leave nuclear as an acceptable substitute when we're not good at building it yet? It's batteries. Why? Because nuclear can run all the time, and then the batteries can cycle daily, and that works extremely well compared to making up for entire seasons of deficits from, shall we say, weather-based energy. That's not to say we're not going to build an enormous amount of wind and solar and find ways to use it effectively for the future. It's only to say that in a world of cheap batteries, you have a suddenly return, very strong argument for investing the enormous nation scale efforts into learning how to build big energy infrastructure projects like nuclear plants again in the West, and to put them nearby cities where we already have nuclear plants in countries like America where it's not illegal, like in Australia. We can add sometimes double the amount of nuclear power to our nuclear plants sitting between our major cities. We don't have to change the transmission grid. We don't have to fight any jurisdictional battles over that. Everybody who's living around a 40-year-old nuclear plant, they want that nuclear plant and they probably work at it. So you don't have NIMBY issues. It's a way of taking the lessons of the leader cities in the 60s, where although we didn't do it for nature, we didn't do it for the climate, we did it so we could have an efficient use of steady, non-fossil power near cities. That sounds a lot like what we're looking for in the future of cities and energy supply today. So I'm just going to put it out there that learning these lessons of the past is going to help us in constructing energy systems that in some countries or in some regions are beautifully combined with new technologies like batteries.
Mark just said a bunch of interesting things where I'd like to touch on. One of you're talking about these district heating is how we talk about it in Europe, these multi-building heating and cooling systems. And they're a great example of something, A, works great and has real efficiencies to it. B, requires some collective action. It's not just the individual building owner that's doing it, unless you have one real estate developer that builds all of it. And so it seldom happens in the US for that reason. And you could even do things similar like that in residential scale. If we all had ground source heat pumps for every new neighborhood that was built, that would be much more efficient and a great way to lower heating and cooling costs. But we don't. There are collective action problems. And it also highlights that it's easier to get something right first than it is to revamp it when you're talking about infrastructure. Because the likelihood of major cities that don't have district heating or cooling going back and adding it is very, very low. I wanted to say zero. I'll grant that there is some small possibility in some isolated situations. But if you're building a new city, you have a chance to do things right. Now, are new cities being built this way? Not that I know of, but China's been on an enormous construction spree, and I don't see any signs that things like that are happening. Saudi Arabia is trying to do some provocative things. So you see their plans for Naam, for instance, whether or not it ever gets built, really, which I'm a skeptic of, certainly the line getting built. But even Naam as a city, does it get built? I don't know. Dubious. But in their plans, you don't see things like this, even though they would be more efficient. And so maybe there's some design path we've gone down to just force these things out of collective memory. The other thing is talking about nuclear or any energy source, really, I think there's a couple things that come to mind for me. One is you really can't differentiate urban and rural at some level when you get to the energy system, because cities in places that are super sunny can generate a meaningful chunk of electricity from distributed resources. The only one being distributable really at that level is solar. But almost no city on Earth can generate all of its energy that way. And a lot of cities are not in the sunniest places. So whether you're bringing in utility scale solar, utility scale wind, which definitely has to be in rural areas away from population centers, or nuclear, or natural gas, or geothermal, you've got an integrated energy system that spans ranges of at least many hundreds of kilometers. And every model says the larger you build up the grid, the better. So that's one topic. Like the cities are exporters of ideas and economic productivity, and they are importers of food, water, and electricity. And I don't see that changing. So just like that alien model of these are meta-organisms that exist, they have a symbiotic relationship with the areas around them. So we can't think of them as being totally disconnected. And then I think that the comments on nuclear are really interesting because China is able to build nuclear power plants at a cost that makes them more or less competitive with renewables are still soaring a lot faster, even in China, the number one nuclear builder, but they haven't really hit their penetration limits, right? And they haven't really faced winter months with long periods where you don't have enough sun and wind. And so China knows how to do it. Everywhere else on the planet has lost the ability to build nuclear on time or on schedule. And the reason for that is pretty much it's an industry that only works at large scale. It's another collective action problem. If you don't build, an industry atrophies. There was a stat that went around the other day of some enormous fraction of all the people that ever worked on building a new nuclear reactor are retiring in the next 10 years in the US. You lose people, you lose their skills. We've lost the supply chain. And I'm a fan of nuclear. The way to have a nuclear industry that delivers on time and on schedule in the US is have a plan to build 50 new reactors or 100 new reactors. That's how you get to the scale where you build the supply chain, you build the experience, and cookie cutter out the same design as what France did when they built their nuclear fleet. And that's a collective action problem. People are concerned about, do we have the right designs for reactors? And there's a lot of new, fascinating Gen 4 nuclear reactor designs in the pipeline, but the AP1000 is probably good enough for most of our needs if we just had a plan to build a whole large number of them. But no one utility, no one city, no one hyperscaler like a Google or Microsoft can buy enough nuclear to get the industry in the West back on its feet. Either we decide that as a meta-organism of multiple cities now, we're going to do this thing, or it's going to remain expensive and hard to do. And so it's not just about one city, it's about our overall plan.
This issue really comes back to the question of empowerment and a sense of control of your life. And for example, in Australia, we have a lot of what we call owners' corporations for large apartment buildings. And the Victorian government, one of the states, has basically just banned what they call embedded networks because building developers and the providers of these central systems within large apartment buildings have been exploiting people. We have a lot of people who want to defend themselves against being controlled by an owner's corporation or by a business or by a long-term contract with a supplier of anything. That's where, again, when you look at the really rapid changes, the smartphone or a lot of other technologies that can be sold through an appliance supplier without you having to use a tradie to install them, A lot of those things are the things that move fastest. People like them because they have a sense of independence and control. So we're seeing that that's been a big driver in Australia of rooftop solar. It's been about, I want to take some control over my home. And our electricity industry doesn't have a fantastic track record of trustworthiness. And we've seen recently, as people have installed smart meters, electricity companies have offered them low prices during the day and very high prices at other times. And people are being forced to try to make choices about what tariff should I be on. And then when I go on that, the company changes. Again, in Australia, an average Australian household, about 3 or 4% of their annual expenditure is on household energy. They don't actually want to spend enormous amounts of time. And we've got an organisation called Energy Consumers Australia who do regular research, which shows the majority of Australians don't want to be interested in energy and they want a sense of self-control. We can all talk about our technological solutions and all of that. And also, Mark certainly is focused on just how amazingly innovative people are and technology evolution is. But we need to keep in mind that people think they want certain services, which they may or may not really need. And that's what they really want. And energy and technology and even services, if they don't fit into what people really want, they won't be successful.
My team's thinking about nuclear power in particular is fundamentally through an economic lens. But now this is a little bit fraught with difficulty because it's like everything is moving. There's no any sort of ceteris paribus assumption. Any all else equal assumption you make is going to just tie you up in knots and get you into trouble. And so what I mean by that is at the moment, at least the way that we look at it, it's very difficult to make a case for large scale nuclear power on the economics of it. It's just getting harder every day to compete with on a project basis, certainly on the CapEx and OpEx outlook for solar combined with batteries, for example, or solar and wind combined with batteries. It's really hard to make that picture work out. Even in China, it's challenging, but certainly in other places, just costs are a pretty formidable obstacle. But at the same time, on a 15-year, 20-year time horizon, like I was saying earlier, costs are going to plummet across the board because of the two primary factors that determine the cost of everything, energy and labor, are trending downward, and they're going to trend downward in a fairly radical way over the next couple of decades. And so at that point, if we fast forward out to the mid-2040s, what does economic logic mean? If you had superabundant labor, for example, a lot of things become possible that just today are obviously economically irrational. Another example of where the logic changes if you head out far enough for labor costs to plummet is the replacement of infrastructure, for example. So we talked about that already. Yes, today, that's an expensive prospect. It's a difficult prospect. Digging up existing infrastructure is enormously challenging, enormously difficult. It's not that it's impossible. It's a formidable challenge, primarily economically, and then secondarily, through hops, skips, and jumps, also economic, even if the first steps in that chain are political or social. But ultimately, those things reduce to economic logic quite straightforwardly as well. If things were cheap enough, then we would not debate them so intensely politically. We would not fight over them so much socially. If things were cheap enough, if it were feasible enough economically, a lot of the other debates that we have to start evaporate. So one thing I think that my team certainly cautions policymakers and investors against is optimizing for a situation that isn't going to continue to exist for very long. And right now, a lot of the optimization we're doing is ultimately either first order or at second order effects, is we're optimizing on cost. And if costs are going to change radically in any direction, but especially if they're going to fall, then our thinking needs to be a number of steps looking forward rather than just looking at what's right in front of us today. It's a big mistake to optimize for something, presuming it's constant when in fact it's variable. That doesn't automatically lead to direct answers, but it does lead to interesting conversation.
Coming back to this issue of cost, I think one of the interesting ones for me is over what time frame. The city I live in is having enormous debates about the very long time it will take and the amount of money it will take to build an underground railway line. There's a lot of skepticism about it and debate. The government is saying, look, our city's growing and we need this infrastructure. But one of our challenges is that most of our policy decisions are based on an assumption of a 7% per annum discount rate when they're doing the policy analysis, which really means that anything beyond about 15 years is just never going to be cost effective, according to our economic experts. And so we've got these tensions between quick, modular, flexible, whatever, and long-term investment in infrastructure. When I point out to people the railway line that I live near was built in the 1860s and has driven the viability of a whole lot of high-density development and community and all sorts of things. If it wasn't here, we wouldn't have it. So what was that worth? If we discounted the cost of that railway line at the time at 7% per annum, it would never have been built. So I don't know how you solve that, because that comes back to Mark's point about everything's changing so much. For example, Sydney just spent incredible amounts of money putting in a light rail. And now the Chinese are using these trackless trams, which basically can do the same thing with almost no infrastructure investment. It's a fascinating time to live.
I think those are really good questions. I just want to underline, I saw everybody nodding when Adam's comment that if things didn't cost so much, we'd spend a lot less time politically arguing about them. And I think that's actually key insight. That's actually one analogy I think about is I'm an investor is what I actually do in most of my time, but I'm a student of the cost curves of these technologies. And solar and wind got cheap because we used a lot of policy to scale them and thus drove the learning rate. Every time solar scale doubles, costs go down about 30%, wind maybe 15%. So we needed Germany and places in Europe and kept wanting to subsidize them for a long time to get them cheap enough. But batteries got cheap because people were using them in laptops and on cell phones. And that's what actually got them to be cheap enough that they made sense in EVs. Do you think it's fascinating that when something is already cheap enough, it has a tendency to get even cheaper if it's mass produced? I think this question of how cheap will things be in the future is a really important one. And I think if I put different levels of confidence, fully agree, intellectual work, or at least of a limited sort, analysis and synthesis is plunging in cost. I fully buy into intelligence as a service. And certainly most rote parts of intellectual labor will drop in cost a lot. What the demand elasticity for those services is, I think we don't know, but it sure looks to me like there's actually huge, latent, untapped, unrealized demand for lots of types of data analysis and lots of types of assistance with designing something or writing something and so on. I actually think this is part of why I'm optimistic on humans still having some employment. I think AI will be used to just do loads of stuff that we never would have done before as one of its primary purposes. On clean energy, obviously, it's very clear the cost of solar and batteries, particular and wind, will keep on plunging. On labor, on physical labor is where I'm actually most uncertain and perhaps skeptical. It's not at all clear to me that robots are really going to have anything like the same curve as AI in a digital sense. I'm a skeptic on humanoid robots. Not that they will have no applications whatsoever, but I think they are massively overhyped right now. I wish I could short some startups. Will be famous last words when they all become giga unicorns. You can laugh at me for people who are bad investments. But nevertheless, I think it's unproven. We have robots now. They're actually an important part of how we make our physical goods. They exist in factories and they do certain things. And I think that will keep on going. China's obviously the leader on that. So if you get to a point where data analysis and intelligence, if you will, with a small I, is super cheap, but we haven't really made stuff in the physical world that much cheaper, I think that's the tendency as the most likely future. And I'll add to that a lot of why things are more expensive in the physical world is almost cost disease, if you will. And some of that is regulatory. It doesn't mean that all regulation is bad, but we just have certain bars for how safe things have to be. Those bars go up all the time. So I'm not at all certain that massive construction projects will get cheaper. I'm not at all certain that construction of big buildings or bridges or nuclear reactors will get a whole lot cheaper. They can be brought down in cost. Some just do ordinary things. But that doesn't mean that there's no role for trains or bridges or nuclear power plants. These things serve roles that are actually very hard to serve in other ways. And with nuclear, again, since I'm famous as a big solar booster, I want to say the real thing that we need nuclear for are those periods when the weather is not favorable. Because 12-hour storage that cycles daily is on path to become economically viable. The cost of energy storage is mostly the CapEx divided by how many times you actually get to use it. That's a very simplified model, obviously. If you cycle your storage every day and it lasts for 10 years or 20 years, call CapEx divided by 7,000. Forget discount rates, blah, 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 blah. If you want to do month-long storage, and our grids, our continental scale grid simulations show that in Europe, if you want a completely solar and wind grid, you might need 4 weeks or 6 weeks of energy storage. That means you might actually cycle it 4 times a year. And that ends up being ludicrously expensive. So I think we actually do have to figure out how to get good again at things like nuclear reactors and bridges and roads and skyscrapers and prefab housing and all of this stuff. And I think a lot of that is not about technology. Technology can play a role. I've seen, how many companies have I seen that print homes, okay, or that make them all with robots? A bunch. I've seen a lot of deck, been on the cap table of one. How many of those have succeeded in any material way? Zero. Because the issue is not actually technology. The issue is a whole bunch of consumer expectations and regulations about how we build buildings is actually what blocks them. I'm a tech guy. I'm a numbers guy. I'm a futurist. I'm a sci-fi writer. I hate having to think about policy, but policy is actually the thing that gates so much of our progress.
And I'll just say on the nuclear thing, I don't think people quite realize how utterly conservative China is being on nuclear. China's building nuclear at a tiny fraction of the per capita rate that France was building nuclear back in the day. And although I know when I first got into nuclear, I said, oh, we should do like France did and build the same design over and over. I got to say that each of the French nuclear plants has a huge amount of custom design work. It's just that they had an order book that was all managed by the same entity. It's that they had a supply chain that was all managed by the same officials. It's that they made a commitment to a large order. They made a commitment to a national program. And it meant that they could even have different architecture approaches and different layouts and different plant arrangements at each of their plants. But because they were building between 2 and 6 units per site, and because they had a common owner that was good at ordering and getting its nuclear plants delivered on time and on budget, that ended up being more important than even the design being the same each time. It's crazy how much detail there is when you start zooming into some of these systems. But that means that contrary to the wildest visions of the nuclear bros and contrary to the wildest, let's say, attacks from people who think that there's no role for nuclear, there are ways for the West to come back in nuclear. As you said, Ramez, there is room for it to be implemented. And I honestly see batteries as the magic thing that are going to help make the argument if the super teams of utilities, demand, load, and politics, culture come together to do call it a sort of a synthetic version of having a state nuclear sector like what Russia and China are doing. If those super teams are able to come together, the market signal for it is a little stronger in Europe than in America, where we have super cheap fossil fuels and a wavering commitment to climate change, compared to Europe with a stronger commitment to climate change, the wolf at the door in terms of geopolitics, and no real giant source of domestic fossil fuels, except for maybe coal in some regions of the dirtiest coal in the world. I don't think that they're going to go back to that. It means that there's a market for nuclear. When you were talking about the 12-hour cycled storage, it's just funny because hundreds of gigawatt hours of storage were built for nuclear plants in Western USA, Central and Southern USA, in China, in Britain. We used to build enormous quantities of 12-hour storage that was cycled daily for nuclear. Then when we stopped building out nuclear, it went along with no longer having the stomach for the massive projects to do the 12-hour storage. Batteries are bringing that back without needing to have the same mass, discipline, giant construction project, moving whole mountains approach that we did to build that storage in the first place. Because we're now able to see a line of sight towards affordable 12-hour storage, it means that, yes, that's going to help a lot of digesting different supply curves from different power plants. But it also means we're going to get better at transforming giant loads like cities into something that looks more like a year-round baseload. Batteries help smooth out supply. What they do even better is they help smooth out demand. And smoothing out demand is quite literally what it looks like when you flatten into annual averages that work well with baseload. None of saying those things is going to automatically get us to nuclear. It is going to be a very hard road to travel. I'm working on these projects to get common order books for large groups of consumers, large packets of cities, large data center developers, all to come together and say, we will be part of a common project that delivers at a longer timescale. And boy, it's hard. I'll tell you, nobody's happier with a power plant than when you get a heritage nuclear plant near a city. The problem is our cities are just now waking up to the fact that they've been powered by those local nuclear plants for 40 years. They didn't know, they didn't care, they didn't do it themselves, and they didn't reach out to try to buy a long-term contract. In Illinois, we have this weird situation where we've got about 8 million people in Chicagoland. it's approximately 100% nuclear. It swings up and down between 120% nuclear supply, and we're exporting it, and down to 80 or 70 on a super high demand day or part of a day. But the yearly average is about 90, 95, 100% nuclear. But nobody in Chicago knows that. Certainly the city officials don't know that. You would think they would have woken up a few weeks ago when AI, the canary in the coal mine in some ways, a very large canary, a 500-pound canary, taking out all the oxygen in the coal mine maybe. We had Meta buy out all the production from one of our local nuclear plants for 20 years. And you would think that would be like a wake-up call to say, hey, that one down, 10 more reactors to go. That's it. That's our entire supply. And they just bought out 1 out of 11 reactors. Each reactor powers about 1 million people or one giant data center. And we're just looking at the math where the math on AI, the load curves, the demand from AI being constant, it looks like the demand from cities if you squint. Or if you add batteries to the city to smooth out demand, we have this leading edge. One of the horsemen of the energy apocalypse here is these giga-scale data centers, where one big data center may be 1 reactor or 1 million people at a city. So you can start to do really simple math. A reactor, a data center, 1 million people in a city. You can see 8 reactors super close to Chicago, 8 million people. One by one, those might go to data centers before Chicago wakes up and realizes, wait, this whole time we've been running on nuclear as baseload? Yes, it does not guarantee that we're going to realize this in time to add nuclear. But I will tell you that when you put 8 million people in a relatively small area and you put a lake on one side of it, there are some difficulties in making faraway electricity and bringing it in on transmission networks that connect through those local nuclear plants. So even though solar may be dropping in cost, it's not a one-for-one substitute with how we've been so effectively powering the city. In Chicago, we did not see price rises for electricity during the electricity crisis of 2022, 2023. And it was a total accident. It's that we were about to shut down our nuclear right before the gas crisis and right before the AI crisis. Then the nuclear got bailed out with a long-term, low-cost, fixed-price contract. That ended up saving the city during the turnaround with the gas crisis where baseload prices went to the moon, followed by the AI demand. And those contracts are going to roll off without Chicago, which again is just an interesting example city here because it is so dominated by an all-electric mindset from the 1960s, 70s. It's not clear that, despite my optimism about cities and the future of energy in cities, that decision makers will wake up from anything other than effectively a blackout or a giant electricity crisis from data centers coming and buying up city-scale power plants for their city-scale demand at constant city scale, like city pattern needs, 24 hours a day, 365.
I wanted to switch back to the demand side where what we're finding, for example, with housing is that going from your Australian house that's not very well insulated with a very inefficient ducted gas system to the what now is a mandated 7-star, which is fairly good performer, not as good as some countries, but anyway, with reverse cycle air conditioners and things like that, you are talking about 80% reduction in energy consumption and, importantly, dramatic reductions in peak demand in winter and in summer. So this is where we come back to this whole point that I keep saying. People want services. They want a comfortable, healthy home or a productive office space or whatever they want, something that produces widgets they can make money from. So to my mind, you start there and you ask the question, again, the International Energy Agency has spent the last decade talking about the multiple benefits of energy efficiency. And this again comes back to the point that people want a service. The service is comfort, health, productivity, low maintenance, reliability. There's all these dimensions that are there. There was a study ages ago where in office buildings where it was discovered that no one actually thought about energy at all when they were setting up for their photocopiers and their offices and things like that. To my mind, energy, technology and culture are all inputs to the perception of what a service is and the perception of how the service can be provided. And in that context, in my own home, my peak demand never goes above 4 kilowatts. Why do I need 3-phase power? I don't. We're looking at, for example, in country areas in Australia where people are facing power failures because of bushfires and floods and all sorts of things like that. So there's a lot of interest developing around fringe of grid in resilience. And as Ramez was pointing out, the more volume you get, the cheaper all of those things get. And it has the big advantage that it gives people a sense of control and independence, which is actually highly valued. Again, going back to like large buildings, we've got all these large buildings that try to put in big central systems. And then the tenants are exploited by the people who run those systems and the people who fund them. That is not healthy. So you come back to the question of, in a sense, how do you run a proper democratic, empowering cultural system and political system? Because people's attitudes are very much shaping a focus on efficient renewables, efficient electrification, without them even realising it's about efficiency. There's big change. And again, if you go back to a lot of developing countries, there's really interesting things about the swappable battery concept for people who can't afford to be on the grid because they can't pay the fixed charges and things like that. There's the importance of portable storage and energy solutions for lots of developing countries. I remember I did some work on the Philippines a while ago, and they said, look, we're not going to have teachers or healthcare or a whole lot of things on a lot of our 1,000 islands. So we're rolling out a really good internet. We're rolling out local renewable solutions. They would even have standard packages of this much PV and these various bits, depending on the size of your household. All of these things transforming the whole picture. So when you come down to it, you have to ask the question, what factors are influencing the decisions people are making about living in cities, about energy supply, about access instead of thinking about physical transport? There are all these issues that fundamentally can change quite quickly. That's where modular mass production, things sold by appliance stores, not installed by electricians and plumbers, all of these things have got a lot of advantages that are not necessarily recognised by a lot of the top-down thinkers. In Australia, energy policy people just keep getting everything wrong because they don't understand that it's all driven from the end consumer. And the end consumer is the last one they think about. And I say, we've got a third of our homes are renters. In fact, a lot of our businesses are renters. That seriously influences their thinking.
What Alan's talking about is really interesting. It's about the democratization of energy, right? And a lot of it is how much permission you need to do things, where is it permissionless? And today in the bulk of the world, it is not at all permissionless. If you want to install solar on your roof, you got multiple permits in most parts of the world, more in the US than most. And the utility itself, who in a way has a conflict of interest, has to approve that you're doing this. And so I do think this world in the future where we democratize energy more, we give people more ability to choose with less regulatory bottleneck is a very powerful idea. But I don't want to come across as saying that it's all rosy. It has some real challenges. We have this notion of the utility death spiral. It hasn't really happened, but there's certainly a fear in Europe where we have higher amounts of distributed solar penetration. Then you're not paying the utility for electricity. But again, most of what you're paying the utility for electricity is not generation, it's actually the grid. And so what does that mean for the cost of those poles and wires? Because you still need those poles and wires in December. So there are business models and market structure changes that need to happen if we really want this to happen.
Particularly prominent example of that utility death spiral you talked about, Ramez. We're seeing something like that in Pakistan now. In rural Pakistan, a startling emergent situation there where the adoption of distributed solar has been so rapid that the local utilities are scrambling. And it's precisely for what you said. It's because the plummeting revenue base makes it look very difficult or impossible to maintain the infrastructure that's necessary to support these centralized grid-based energy services.
A good example of that is Western Australia, where the government-owned network operator discovered that 52% of their network was supplying 3% of their customers. And they now have a very advanced rollout of taking people off the grid. And because they're a government monopoly and they've got organisation that was being talked about earlier, essentially they're saying, look, we'll take you off the grid and it'll be cheaper for you and more reliable for you. the fact that they have bushfires and all sorts of other problems with power lines. It's like they've got all these great anecdote stories of the people who've gone off the grid and how we were laughing. Everyone down the road was out of power for 8 hours the other day and we were fine. And there's just a whole transformation going on. And as far as the network operator, because they're a government agency, not a for-profit one, they simply see, they look at the multiple benefits of reduced insurance costs for bushfires caused by power lines. They look at the maintenance benefits. They look at the fact that a lot of their power lines have 30% line losses. There's just so many factors that all come down. They can have a smaller team of workers because these systems are all pretty much running independently. I never try to forecast anything because all of the disruptions and the things coming from so many different directions, as Adam's pointed out, just means that it's an amazing time and it's chaotic, but we're heading at an amazing speed to somewhere else. It's just that from a point of view of climate, we're 30 years too late. But that's another issue that we haven't really gotten onto. One of the big issues we're seeing is that now in Australia with buildings, everyone's now realising that the embodied emissions in the concrete and steel and glass of your new building actually a bigger impact than the lifetime operation of the building. So suddenly we're getting new rating schemes for embodied emissions. And we've got a group called MECLA who are working on cutting embodied emissions in building structures and infrastructure generally. So again, this is the other thing is that once you change the game, the priorities shift around in all sorts of quirky ways. And again, what we've seen with solar is early on, people were getting 60 cents a kilowatt hour for exports. The Victorian government has just introduced a new minimum of zero. A whole lot of people who listen to the government and the industry put in big solar systems which generate far more power than they can use, and they were relying on the revenue stream from exports. So now the Australian government's introduced all these big discounts for people who install batteries, but even then, a lot of the cost of a home-level battery is in tradies and the supply chain and all of that. And that's, again, why I see things like the balcony solar in Germany, like the concept of smart swappable batteries and plug-in smart technologies driving your appliances and avoiding the need to upgrade your wiring. This comes back to a point Ramez made, that a lot of the cost of electricity is not production of the electricity. So that's what changes people's perspectives too.
I think what Alan just said was remarkably interesting, and I agree that balcony solar, things that are, again, permissionless, that don't require an electrician to do. And I think maybe in the future, we have startups like Span, for instance, that make smart electricity panels and make it easy to do some of these things. So you still require an electrician. So I can imagine a future where we design houses for upgradability in this way, but we're not there yet. I want to come back to what Adam said about Pakistan. Actually, it's interesting there in that a lot of the reason people went to solar, it wasn't just to save energy, it was because the grid was unreliable. They had power outages. And so now you put solar on your roof, and in a way you're contributing to more unreliability of the grid outside of your house because you're taking money away from the utility. I'm not blaming those people. I think it's great. But again, there's a question of interdependence. We don't have a great way to do collective action here, because what we end up happening is utilities often just act whatever's the best interest of their profits, not what's in the best interest of the overall collective good of access to electricity at a low cost and so on. But homeowners too are like, what's best for me and my house, which there are externalities of this stuff. So we would hope that utility commissions, as we have in the US, would play herd on this, but they are outgunned by utilities in almost all ways and almost all times. We're not picking the most rational plan. We're just feeling our way and zigzagging a bit through different policy choices. Over time, the new policy choice creates an incentive for new technology to meet it, having a new policy problem. We will get there, but it's a little bit of zigzagging on our way to a great energy future.
I want to emphasize one thing that Ramez said, which you use these terms, permission and permissionless. I think that's a great way to frame it. My team has been a staunch and long-term advocate for energy rights, which is a similar kind of idea that in most locales today, you don't have the right to produce and buy and sell and trade electricity the way we take for granted rights in other domains. And that's precisely because we need permission from other authorities. In other words, we need permission. And that's a problem. I would be remiss for not mentioning is that one of the most, I think, significant pieces of research that my team has done was to show that seasonal energy storage isn't necessary for battery capacity if you relax the assumption about how much generated capacity you build. So we did some landmark work about 6 years ago that made this point. And if you're stuck in the old box of thinking that you can only build a little bit of an increment larger than the existing energy capacity we've got today, then sure, you're going to need a month or more of seasonal energy storage. But if you relax that assumption completely and you just run the numbers, especially with cost projections out to the 2030s, what my team found is that in virtually every geographic location, you only need at most 2-3 days, maybe 4 in some of the very high latitude countries, 2-3-4 days worth of energy storage if you supersize the generating capacity. And that is precisely for those most difficult, challenging weeks of winter. And the supersizing that you do can be very, very large. You can have systems where you have 6, 7, 8 times more generating capacity in solar and wind than you do in nameplate capacity of the existing status quo energy system. And that seemed crazy when we said that at the time. But the thing is, what you're optimizing for is on cost. What you spend on the generation, you save on the storage. And so you ultimately end up with the lowest cost system. And so we discovered this interesting convex cost function there. But the upshot of all of that is that when you optimize on cost and you reduce the energy storage capacity that you have, you end up with near zero marginal cost generating capacity. And that enormous capacity is where clean energy superabundance is most likely to come from. And the final thought is that across all of history, energy abundance and human prosperity are deadlocked proportional to one another. There's an enormously strong correlation between the available energy per capita and every other metric of prosperity you create or measure. And there are no exceptions. There are no countries or societies ever in history, including today, where energy per capita consumption is low and prosperity is high, and vice versa. There are no examples of countries where there is high energy consumption per capita and low prosperity on other metrics. They don't exist. That enormously strong correlation points us in a clear direction. More energy is better for humanity. Unfortunately, we are stuck in a framework where the idea of efficiency and the idea of economizing run entirely in the direction of being stuck in a box of scarcity, where less energy is better and we should use as little as possible. And unfortunately, that's fundamentally an error from the perspective of human prosperity. And it's also an error from the perspective of other problem solving. And in my book, which looks at solving environmental problems like climate change, that's included in prosperity. Once you no longer have an ecological footprint, especially emissions for climate, then reducing energy consumption doesn't make any sense. The more energy you have available, the more you can solve problems, including the much harder challenge around climate change, not of getting to zero emissions, but of getting to about 10 gigatons of negative emissions per year. In other words, carbon withdrawal. There's no way to do that without the expenditure of enormous quantities of clean electricity. No way. It's not possible. And there's no way to solve climate change without massive negative emissions. So no amount of downsizing or reducing energy consumption gets you into negative emissions territory. That's logically and physically impossible. The only thing that gets you there is huge amount of energy availability to do the very hard work of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and the oceans. One reason why my team is so bullish on solar and wind is because there's a very clear economic pathway to get us to enormous energy supply that doesn't have an enormous ecological or otherwise environmental toll.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for this discussion. And it pains me so much that I need to stop this because we could talk for hours. You could talk for hours and I'm listening. But I want to be respectful of your time. What is your role in establishing the future of cities and the future of urban energy matrix?
I come from the consumer end. I disagree with Adam about the focus on the supply side simply because people are making choices about things and actually energy is not really a big component of the reason for buying things. It's about delivering services people value or think they need or whatever. Most of the decision making does not involve any consideration of energy whatsoever. So on one hand, I can say, yeah, look, the solutions of high supply of energy and all of that is important, but I'm really focused on a lot of tenants and people who don't have control over the buildings they're living in or who are not able, because they don't have the capital to buy the efficient or the renewable or the battery systems. And so that's where I come from. And I've done work with APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic People. We've looked at a lot of different countries around the Asia Pacific. getting people's lives to a point where they're healthy and can afford a living is very much about a combination of low-cost energy and smart management of energy and high efficiency. In the Philippines, a laptop computer, a mobile phone, and an LED lamp can be delivered to millions of people. A desktop computer, incandescent lights, and the capacity to supply them can't be. So I think that's where I come from. That works just as much in cities, in fact, more in cities, where you have limited access to space and things like that than it does in rural areas.
I've got a couple roles. I invest in startups that are trying to make an abundant future possible, and that's incredibly fun. It's fun because many times a week I have people tell me things that I thought were impossible, and often they actually are, but they're not always. One of the most uplifting things possible is to have entrepreneurs come and show you what they think they can accomplish and walk you through why it actually be doable. And those companies range from new business models for how we deploy solar batteries to new hard tech. The company I'm investing right now is actually making AI more efficient in its use of chips and of energy. So I'll just put in a plug for efficiency. The reason you want it to be more efficient is so you can get more of the thing you want out of it. Making it more efficient is great for the environment, but fundamentally we're doing it because we want more AI. And there are always some real world constraints on how many chips you can buy, definitely constraint there. And there's constraints right now on the grid of like how many data centers and GPUs can you plug in? So making it more efficient is a way to get faster progress for humanity. But I think the bigger impact I've had is actually similar to Adam and Tony and Rethink, is in communicating a vision broadly to the public and to corporations and sovereign wealth funds and banks and so on, that clean energy technology, certainly in electricity and transport at least, are economically disruptive. They have these learning curves, they have these exponential trends in cost. And fundamentally, something not my data, it's Bloomberg's, but I think it's fascinating to communicate. We've passed the point where the clean energy economy is larger than the fossil energy economy. More than $2 trillion in CapEx in clean energy in the last year, and just over $1 trillion in fossil fuels. More investment in solar alone last year than in oil. The EV market is 100%, it's more than 100%, is all the growth in cars. The internal combustion car sales is 2017. So these sorts of things, when decision makers in countries or banks or large companies hear them, change the perspective. Because it turns out almost everyone in power, with a few exceptions, wants to leave the world better than it is now for their kids. And almost all of them believe in climate change. But what they have is they have a fiduciary responsibility to their organization to maximize profits. And so they mostly haven't heard that actually you can make a whole hell of a lot of money and save some money and reduce some risk by pivoting more and more into the clean economy. And fundamentally, capital chases growth, talent chases growth, and political power chases growth. So that's the story that I love to tell again and again. And thanks for having me here.
My early role was making noise about nuclear on the internet, and that's pretty much done. Pretty much the whole internet likes nuclear. The problem is actually building it. Perhaps the most important thing I was noisy about on the internet early on was not shutting down the nuclear plants we already have built that can operate essentially immortally at extremely low rates, especially when combined with clean energy mandates or growing demand for baseload or batteries. They're the perfect complement because they already exist. They're cheap. They're already loved by their communities. We should not shut them off. That era has pretty much ended. Almost no countries on Earth are scheduling turning off their nuclear plants. So that battle is coming to a very lovely close. Thank God. The new challenge, now that people like nuclear, big companies know they want nuclear power, is actually building it, which turns out to be extremely difficult. There are several overlapping reasons. I would say that what I try to do with my consultancy is solve collective action problems that are preventing us from either saving or constructing our nuclear plants. I do advising for some of the breakthrough nuclear reactor technology vendors, but that's a little bit of a long shot, a very difficult road to travel. I want to be there for them if there's breakthroughs, but for some fundamentally physical reasons, it's going to be a little rough to make those be the workhorse of the future. Russia and China can build as many advanced reactors as they want, and they're still almost entirely only building, ordering, or selling the traditional reactors. So us learning how to build that technology again, probably going to be important if nuclear and the expansion of nuclear has any role to play in powering cities in the future. So what do I when I say solving collective action problems? Some of it has nothing to do with my background, which is nuclear engineering. Some of it's as simple as getting as many nations as we can to sign our pledge to say we're going to triple nuclear by 2050. That is not a very ambitious goal compared to in the renewable world. But look, we're starting from a grinding halt or almost backwards movement. We've stopped moving backwards. We're now starting to move forwards. So it's been a great triumph that we now have something like 32 nations that have agreed to our goal of tripling nuclear by 2050. We're also working on the banks and the large multilaterals to agree to the same thing. We've had some success there. Hopefully should have more to announce during Climate Week this year in New York City. And we're getting philanthropies to be open to spending money on doing nuclear right, getting programs moving today so that in 10 years, if we've done a good job on the earliest projects, these early mega projects, building them again, we have more countries or more regions that are open to hosting the next generation of projects. And then finally, the most basic thing is putting together the team of engineering, finance, utilities, and load that can agree on enough common parts of a framework, coalesce around the technology, coalesce around a few sites, and then a common leadership structure, and then actually execute the engineering properly, the engineering management properly. I think that's the biggest and most important thing I can add. And I'm helping on some of those leading efforts to try to herd cats, get a few million people's worth of commitments, both in the power and the willingness to provide the power, and then move forward with the best practices we can gain from the most advanced Western infrastructure projects and bring it all to bear with the best of the veterans, the few remaining veterans, I can say, that remember what it was like building the last set of nuclear plants in the West. That's going to be the work of my next 5 years for sure.
My role is I direct the research team at an organization, RethinkX, whose mission is to catalyze the phase change of humanity to what we call a stellar world. And stellar is a concept that the co-founders of RethinkX have developed. So that's Tony Seba and James Arbib. We borrow the metaphor from stars. A stellar world is one in which a critical mass of productive assets are accumulated such that you pass a critical threshold, an ignition occurs, and the system becomes self-sustaining. We see that possible driven primarily by the disruption of energy and the disruption of labor. And again, as I opened our discussion today, that's where your shovel hits bedrock when you chase everything back to its origins, as far as doing anything, producing anything in an economic sense. And this is fundamentally an economic lens that we look through. And today's economic lens is based on extraction and scarcity. This paradigm is eons old. It's as old as life itself. And so this is a very fundamental transformation that's coming from a condition based on scarcity, where everything was scarce, and energy especially. Energy was food. Food was energy for humanity up until a million or so years ago when we first discovered how to master fire. But prior to that, and for all other species in the world, energy is food and food is energy. That was the first time that we had anything like a surplus, anything like abundance of energy compared to all of the history of biology leading up to that point. So 3.7 billion years. And now we're on the cusp of another change, which is the shift from an energy system like fire, where we burn fuels, we consume inputs, and those consumables are the constraining factor, and everything just downstream of that constraint, to one where a critical mass of material accretes such that the system enters a fundamentally new and self-sustaining condition and just radiates energy, which is what stars do. The critical mass that we see accumulating later is overwhelmingly solar, wind, and energy storage. Again, this is through an economic lens. We just don't see any way for anything right now to compete economically with that. That's not to say that there aren't going to be other energy technologies in the mix. Existing nuclear is a no-brainer and obviously has to stay in the mix. And there may be rules, minor rules for other things as well. But in sheer economic terms, it's difficult today and looking increasingly impossible to compete with solar and wind paired with energy storage, and in particular, electrochemical battery energy storage, of which there are many technologies. We hear a lot about lithium, but there are many. They really do unlock a new kind of condition for humanity in which, again, the supply is extremely large and the marginal cost is very low, close to zero. That is a fundamentally different condition than we've ever had before. Those are the two defining criteria of superabundance. That's the inverse of scarcity. If you have an overwhelmingly large supply and a marginal cost near zero, you don't think about the unit increment as your level of analysis. We've already seen this. We've already seen this happen in information. We've just been through this over the last 30 years. So prior to 1995, information was something that had a high marginal cost and a relatively small supply, a finite supply relative to nominal demand. And so you bought a few articles at a time when you purchased a newspaper, and the individual articles had a measurable, substantial unit cost, a substantial cost at the margin. When you consumed music as a form of information, same thing. Vinyl record or buy a cassette tape or buy a CD, it's a few songs at a time and a cost that you can feel in your wallet. When you developed photographs prior to 1995, you were paying per frame on the rolls of film that you developed. There was a non-trivial unit cost at the margin, and the supply was not infinite. But roll the clock forward 15 years to the year 2010, all of those information goods are super abundant. The supply is enormous, more than any human being could ever individually consume, and the marginal cost is effectively zero. How do we enable all of that? It was massive investment in infrastructure. The logic of them was shaped in a variety of different ways with private and public prioritization, various mechanisms and avenues for return there. But we got it all built. And we live in a very different world now that information and information goods and services are not scarce in the economic sense, limited supply, high marginal cost, but are super abundant in the economic sense. Enormous supply, very low, near zero marginal cost. So business models are completely different, and how we relate to information is completely different. And the thesis here from my team is that what we just saw over the 15 years from 95 to 2010, we're going to see again over the next 20 or so years in energy and in labor. And when that happens, it is the fundamental unlock for human prosperity and civilization. It makes everything else possible. It makes possibilities we can't even imagine yet real. And so that's why I'm excited and optimistic about the future of energy for cities and a whole lot more beyond that. So anything that we need to get done, anything we want to do, anything we can imagine doing, super abundant energy is going to help us do. And cities going to be ground zero for where we do it. So there's every reason to be enormously optimistic and excited about the prospect looking forward. And thanks very much for having me.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
Cities, by collecting a lot of people in one spot who demand a lot of energy, both for things that we do with energy now or electricity now, air conditioning and lighting, and the things that we're going to be doing with electricity in the near future, transport, heating, and cooking, and a few other things. There's an enormous amount of demand in one spot, which leads to collective solutions being economically possible. In the past, that definitely looked in many countries like building nuclear plants. It is a human organization problem. We have an unprecedented number of talented people coming into nuclear energy now. This is a solution that fits, but only if we can deliver it. We are now getting the human talent in order to deliver it. That does not guarantee success. But along with the public license that nuclear is now getting in many countries in the West, we have an opportunity. The window is open. There are a lot of people that don't care about climate change and don't want to do anything about climate change who want nuclear power. There's a lot of people who are deathly scared about climate change and wanting to lower emissions above everything that now think nuclear is one of their allowed technologies to do that. Those two sides can come together. And as long as we have the, let's say, bold vision to do things better than we've done in the past in the nuclear, but also the humility to learn as much as possible from what didn't work and how we failed, including in the near past in the West, I think that we can deliver new nuclear in the West and that it will have a wonderful place for cities and the technologies that are fueling change in the cities in the next 15 years.
I've always been an optimist genetically in me, and being an immigrant, maybe coming to a country that was just far superior to one that I was born in. And there are so many positive trends. I think the rise of AI, reduction of costs in clean energy, and just what we see with poverty dropping, hunger dropping, and so on. I believe that the future, not just for cities, but for planet Earth, is most likely to be tremendously better than it is now. But there are also serious problems. We have substantially bent the curve on climate, but not nearly enough. We're going to face slop, we're going to face freshwater challenges, we're going to face potentially food challenges in some ways, so I'm more optimistic on that. But the thing to understand is that the future is not set in stone. It's definitely not perfect. A lot of things will get better, things will get worse, but the shape of that future depends upon all of our choices. The philosopher Max Moore coined a term called dynamic optimism. He's one of the extropians. He created the term extropians, if any of that deep cut. And the concept of the dynamic optimism is an optimism about the future, not just because it's going to happen without you, but optimism because you will be part of making it happen. And so that's my shout out to everybody listening to this, is build the future that you want to live in and that you want others to be able to live in as well.
I completely subscribe to that. Let's be architects of the future, not victims of it. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today.
It was really interesting to hear the different viewpoints on the urban energy matrix. Alan described Scope 1, 2, 3 emissions in episode 196, and Adam already talked about transformative technologies in episode 222. You can find out more about Alan, Adam, Ramez, and Mark online, all the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding the panelists' approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this panel discussion? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website where the transcripts and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?